My brothers and sisters, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. We come and we enter into these great mysteries. At the 4 o'clock Mass, I had all the little children come up. I'm not going to do that at this Mass. But they came up and I was asking them about what they were expecting. And of course, they said they were expecting Santa, right? But I also tried to remind them that today we're celebrating Jesus' birthday. That here we recognize Almighty God coming so small into our flesh, taking on our humanity. And he says, He did this because you matter. Because you matter to Almighty God. And He wants you to be with Him forever. When we look at the child Jesus in the manger, when we go over to the nativity scene, what is God doing here? What is God doing? Why did He do this? So that. What's the so that of Jesus? Well, if we were to look at, for instance, a picture of the Allied troops on D-Day coming to Normandy, what would we be looking at? What would we say their reason for coming was? Why did they go to France? Because they wanted some baguettes? No. Because they heard that the French beaches were beautiful? No. They came for a very specific reason. They went to Normandy on that day to free an enslaved people from a tyrannical regime. They went onto that beach, and many of them gave their lives in order to set people free who were under a tyrannical regime. When we look at Jesus coming as a baby, He came hiding His Godhead in order to enter into our humanity and do what? Set a people free who are underneath a tyrannical regime. And what is the tyrannical regime? Sin and death. That we are all subject to sin and death. And death, of course, no one gets out of this life alive, but also sin. That's very easy to prove, because how many of us, and I'm looking for a show of hands, how many of us have done something we know we shouldn't do, we hated to do, we couldn't stand that we were doing, we did it anyway? Right? Right? And that's sin. Sin and death are an authority. They are power. And so Jesus comes to set us free from this tyrannical regime, to set us free so that we can have new life. We heard in the first reading today, right? You remember that from Isaiah? You remember what that said? The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. Aren't we walking in darkness? You know, this year, 2025, we celebrate a great Jubilee year. It's 2,025 years since the birth of Jesus. He doesn't look that old, does he? But 2,025 years since the birth of Jesus. We celebrate this in a very special way. And when Pope Francis declared this year of Jubilee, he was saying it's a Jubilee year of hope. And I can be honest here, I haven't really celebrated it that well. You know, we started out, and I talked about it at the beginning of the year, and I quite frankly forgot about it as we went throughout the year. And yet, this year is very important. It's a reminder to us that we have hope in Almighty God. Not just like, oh, well, good feelings, and I really think maybe this will happen someday. But no, hope has an assurance in what God has done. That God says, I have conquered, though not yet destroyed, sin and death. I have conquered, though not yet destroyed, sin and death. We can have hope. We can have hope because while we were walking in darkness, a light has shone. God emptied himself, taking on the likeness of a slave, as St. Paul says in his letter to the Philippians, becoming so small and hiding himself under our humanity so that Satan would then take the bait, as it were, and try to destroy him on the cross. And then with that, it's like that hook got into him and he couldn't escape. While we do not yet see the end of what's going to happen, we do know God wins. God wins. Now, I don't know if, with all the technology and stuff that they have this now, but back when I was growing up, when I was growing up, we had like the math books, right? And you people my age and older, you'll remember that we had to get those paper bags and, make book covers for them because they weren't our books, they were the school's books, and so we had to protect them. You remember all that. But so the math books, we would have the answers in the back would have all the odd questions answered. So if the teachers wanted us not to look at the answers, they'd give us the even ones, or if they said, well, we want you to try to come up with the answer, but we want to make sure you find the right answer, but you have to get to it, they'd give us the odd answers. But so the answers were at the end of the book. Well, same thing in the Bible, right? In the back of the Bible, we have the book of Revelation. God wins. The answers are in the back. God wins. And the incredible gift is that when we are walking through the darkness of our lives and we can't see the end, we can look to Jesus and remember in his humanity, he had to suffer poverty. He had to suffer cold. He had to suffer where he didn't even have a home, as it were, for so many years as they had to go escape to Egypt and then come back. Laboring day in and day out as a common laborer. And then when he started his ministry, rejected by the people he loved, and then eventually killed. But then he rose from the dead. Then he rose from the dead. He broke the power of that darkness. And he can do this in our lives. So today, as we come around the manger, today as we enter into the mystery of God, taking on our humanity, let's ask God for that strength, for that grace, for that wisdom to be able to see that light, even in the midst of our darkness. That as we walk through the darkness of the valley of the shadow of death, no evil shall we fear, because our God is Emmanuel, God with us. He is here. Now, just as an aside, it's not just that he's close to us, God with us, Emmanuel, but he's with us as opposed to against us. That God is for us. God is with us because he's for us. And if God is for us, who can be against? So we turn to our God, who became so small, so weak, and we say, Jesus, help us to see in you how you have conquered the darkness, conquered sin and death, so that we may walk in the light.